Henry Donovan was a 42-year-old billionaire who had everything the world could offer: money, influence, and power. Yet, his vast mansion echoed with emptiness. Beneath the opulent chandeliers and behind the luxurious furniture, a longing gnawed at him. He lacked an heir. Twice married, both relationships had crumbled under the weight of his need for control. Love, he decided, was an illusion, a distraction he no longer sought. But a child was different. A child would secure his legacy, a continuation of everything he had built. Determined to avoid entanglements, Henry devised a plan. He would pay someone to bear him a child. It was a business transaction, pure and simple. No strings, no emotions, just a contract. The next morning, he instructed his assistant to find him a candidate. But as fate would have it, destiny was about to intervene. Driving through the city that afternoon, Henry stopped at a red light near the bustling downtown district. Among the sea of indifferent faces, his gaze fell on a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, sketching on a tattered piece of paper. She had shoulder-length brown hair that fell messily around her face and startling green eyes that shone despite her disheveled appearance. There was something about her, a quiet resilience, that Henry couldn't ignore. The light turned green, but he didn't move. Instead, he studied her intently. Why was she so absorbed in her drawings, oblivious to the chaos around her? Annoyed at his curiosity, he drove away. Yet, her image lingered in his mind, like a puzzle demanding to be solved. Minutes later, Henry pulled into a parking lot and sat staring at the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. Against his better judgment, he turned the car around and drove back. She was still there, leaning her drawing against the wall. Rolling down his window, he called out, "You, come here." The young woman looked up, her expression cautious. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Just get in the car, I don't have all day." She hesitated, glancing between him and the luxury car. "I'm not that kind of woman, if that's what you're thinking." Henry's brow furrowed. "Don't be absurd. I just want to talk. Now get in, or you can go back to sketching on that sidewalk." Reluctantly, she climbed into the car, and the silence between them was heavy as he drove to a quiet cafe on the city's outskirts. Once seated, Henry finally spoke. "What's your name?" "Emily Carter," she replied cautiously. "Why do you care?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," Henry said bluntly. "Tell me, Emily, why are you sitting on the sidewalk, drawing like nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Because there's nothing else to do. I lost everything, my job, my home, my family. Drawing helps me forget." Henry leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Emily crossed her arms defensively. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to have my child." The words hung in the air, absurd and surreal. Emily blinked, certain she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" "I'm serious," he said. "I'll cover all your expenses, give you a safe place to stay, and at the end you'll walk away with enough money to start a new life. No strings attached." Emily let out a humorless laugh. "You can't be serious. What kind of man makes that kind of offer to a stranger?" "The kind who knows what he wants," Henry said, his tone unyielding. "I don't want a relationship. I don't want emotional drama. I just want an heir. And I believe you're the right person for the job." She stared at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. His cold, calculating demeanor left no doubt he meant every word. "This is madness," she said finally. "No woman in her right mind would agree to this." "No woman in your position would refuse," he countered. "I'm offering you a way out of your current situation, a chance to rebuild your life." Emily looked away, grappling with the weight of his words. Every day was a struggle to survive, but could she really give up so much of herself for money? "And what happens after the baby is born?" she asked. "You'll get the agreed sum and you'll be free to go, legally binding, no strings attached." The cold finality of his answer sent a chill down her spine. "I need time to think," she said at last. "You have 24 hours, Henry replied. "After that, the offer's off the table." He left her at the cafe, and Emily spent the night wandering the city, torn between desperation and dignity. By morning, she had made her decision. When Emily arrived at Henry's office, her eyes were tired but resolute. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's make it official." He handed her a contract meticulously drafted by his lawyers. Emily read every word, her stomach churning at the clinical language that reduced her role to a transaction. But she signed it, sealing the deal. Henry wasted no time. That same day, Emily was moved into his sprawling mansion, a place so vast and grand it felt more like a museum than a home. She was given a luxurious suite, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a bathroom larger than her old apartment. The days that followed were surreal. Emily underwent medical examinations, was assigned a personal nutritionist, and was chauffeured everywhere by Henry's staff. Yet, despite the luxury, she felt like a guest in her own life. Henry, true to his word, kept his distance. Their interactions were brief and to the point, his cold professionalism never wavering. But late at night, as Emily lay in her lavish bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a deal with the devil. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The weeks passed, and Emily found herself adjusting to her new life at Henry's mansion. Despite the luxurious surroundings, she often felt out of place. The staff was polite, attentive even, but there was always a professional distance. She spent most of her time alone in her suite or walking through the gardens, trying to come to terms with what she had agreed to. Yet, the quiet moments in the garden often felt suffocating, filled with questions she was too afraid to answer. Henry, meanwhile, remained an enigma. He rarely spoke to her beyond the necessities, keeping their interactions strictly professional. But Emily began to notice subtle cracks in his icy exterior. On occasion, she would catch him watching her, as though he were trying to figure her out. It was unnerving, but it also piqued her curiosity. Who was this man who could offer such a clinical proposition yet display fleeting moments of vulnerability? One evening, as Emily sat sketching on the balcony of her suite, she heard a soft knock at her door. It was Stephanie, Henry's personal assistant. "No, Miss Carter," Stephanie began with her usual politeness, "Mr. Donovan has requested your presence in the study." Emily blinked, surprised. "Now? Did he say why?" Stephanie shook her head. "He only mentioned that it was important." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Emily followed Stephanie through the mansion's sprawling halls to Henry's study. The room was exactly as she had imagined: dark wood paneling, shelves lined with books, and a large mahogany desk that seemed to dominate the space. Henry was seated behind it, his expression unreadable. "You want to see me?" Emily asked, stepping inside. Henry gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit." As she complied, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. For a moment, he said nothing, simply studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "I've been reviewing the contract," he said finally. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Is there a problem?" "No, not a problem," Henry replied, his tone measured. "But I've realized that while the terms are clear, there's one thing we didn't account for." Emily frowned. "What's that?" "Your involvement after the child is born." Her breath caught. "I thought the arrangement was that I'd leave once the baby is delivered." Henry admitted, "but I've been reconsidering." Emily's stomach churned. She had spent countless nights preparing herself for the day she would have to walk away, convincing herself that it was for the best. Now, Henry was suggesting something different. "What are you saying?" she asked cautiously. "I'm saying that perhaps it would be beneficial for the child if you stayed," Henry said. "Not indefinitely, but long enough to ensure a smooth transition. A few months, perhaps." Emily stared at him, trying to decipher his motives. Was this about the child, or was it about him? She couldn't tell, and that made her uneasy. "I don't know," she said finally. "This wasn't part of the deal." "I understand that," Henry said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it." With that, he dismissed her, leaving her to wrestle with yet another unexpected turn in their arrangement. The following days were tense. Emily tried to distract herself with her sketches, but her mind kept returning to Henry's proposition. She couldn't deny that the idea of staying with her child, at least for a little while, was tempting. But she also knew it would make leaving even harder when the time came. Meanwhile, Henry seemed more present than usual. He began joining her for meals, asking about her day, and even showing an interest in her sketches. Emily was cautious at first, unsure of his intentions, but she couldn't deny that his company was a welcome change from the solitude. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Henry surprised her with a question. "Do you regret saying yes to my offer?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. Emily hesitated, caught off guard. "I don't know. Some days yes, other days not as much." Henry nodded as though he had expected her answer. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can take such unexpected turns." Emily glanced at him, surprised by the introspection in his tone. "I suppose it is, but I think the strangest part is how quickly we can adapt." Henry's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "You've adapted well." "I don't really have a choice," Emily replied with a shrug. "It's either adapt or fall apart." Henry's expression grew serious. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." The compliment caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. But as they continued walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was starting to see her as more than just the woman carrying his child. As the months passed, the dynamic between them continued to shift. Henry, who had always been so guarded, began to open up. He shared stories from his childhood, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before wealth and power had hardened him. Emily, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own past, her dreams of becoming an artist, the family she had lost, the struggles that had brought her to that sidewalk where Henry had found her. Their conversations became a source of comfort for both of them, a way to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. But even as they grew closer, Emily couldn't ignore the growing bond she felt with the child she carried. She knew it was dangerous to let herself hope for more than what had been agreed upon. But the lines between their arrangement and reality were becoming increasingly blurred. And one evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Henry broke the silence with a question that took Emily by surprise. "Emily, have you thought about names?" Emily looked at him, startled. "Names?" "For the baby," Henry clarified. "It's something we should start thinking about." Emily hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't think you'd want my input." Henry's gaze softened. "Of course I do. This isn't just my child, it's ours." The words hit her like a blow, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had spent so long preparing herself to let go, to be nothing more than a footnote in the child's life. Now, Henry was suggesting something entirely different. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The day of the ultrasound appointment arrived, and Emily found herself more nervous than she had expected. Henry insisted on accompanying her, a gesture that surprised her more than it should have. As they sat in the examination room, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the air, a strong, steady rhythm that brought tears to Emily's eyes. "It's a boy," the doctor announced with a smile, "and he's perfectly healthy." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but when she glanced at Henry, she was surprised to see a flicker of emotion cross his usually stoic face. For the first time, she saw not the businessman who had orchestrated this arrangement, but a man who was genuinely moved by the life they had created. As they left the appointment, Henry turned to her. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly, "for everything." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. But as they drove back to the mansion, she realized that her feelings for Henry were becoming far more complicated than she had anticipated. That evening, as Emily lay in bed, she found herself thinking about Henry's words. For all his faults, he was trying in his own way. And as much as she wanted to keep her guard up, she couldn't deny that he was beginning to break through her defenses. In the weeks that followed, their relationship continued to evolve. Henry began spending more time with her, joining her for walks in the garden and even helping her decorate the nursery. The once cold and distant man was slowly being replaced by someone who seemed to genuinely care, not just about the child, but about her. And Emily, despite her best efforts to remain detached, found herself caring too. The days turned into weeks, and Emily's pregnancy became more pronounced. Her days at the mansion, once monotonous, were beginning to feel layered with complexity. While she had adapted to the physical comforts of her new life, her emotional landscape was less certain. Henry had shifted in ways she had not anticipated. Small gestures of care, thoughtful questions, and moments of quiet vulnerability. And yet she wasn't sure if she could trust these changes. Was it genuine, or was he simply ensuring the arrangement remained free of complications? Henry, for his part, found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. For so long, his world had been governed by structure and predictability, but now Emily was challenging that. Not overtly, but in the quiet way she carried herself, in her resilience, and in the unspoken bond she was forming with the child growing inside her. It was during one such quiet moment, late at night, that Henry made a decision that would alter the course of their arrangement. He knocked softly on Emily's door, an action so unlike him that she was startled when she opened it. "Henri?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and caution. "I thought you might like some company," he said simply, holding up a bottle of sparkling water and 2 glasses. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. He settled on the small sofa in her suite, pouring a glass for each of them. She joined him, her hands nervously clutching her glass. "I wanted to ask you something," he began, his tone uncharacteristically uncertain. "When this is all over, what do you want to do? What's your plan?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "I guess I've been too focused on getting through the present." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about it too, about what happens next." "And," she prompted, her heart beating faster. "And I think..." He paused, as though searching for the right words. "I think it might be better if you stay." Emily's breath caught. "Stayed? What do you mean?" "For the child," Henry clarified, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It might be better for him to have both of us around, at least in the beginning." Emily stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. It was the first time he had suggested anything beyond the rigid terms of their contract. She wanted to believe he was doing this for the child, but part of her wondered if there was more. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, as though that was all he had hoped for, and after a few minutes of quiet conversation, he left her alone with her thoughts. A week later, Emily found herself in the nursery, arranging the tiny clothes and toys that had begun to fill the space. She had tried to maintain an emotional distance, but as the due date approached, it was becoming harder. She picked up a small, knitted blanket and ran her fingers over the soft fabric, imagining the baby wrapped in it. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Henry enter the room. "It's coming together nicely," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Emily turned, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, stepping further into the room. "I just wanted to see how things were going." "They're fine," she replied, setting the blanket down. "Everything's almost ready." Henry walked over to the crib, his hand brushing the smooth wood. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "I've spent my whole life planning every detail of everything I do, but this feels different. It feels unpredictable." Intradictable. Emily watched him, her heart softening despite herself. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," she said gently. "Sometimes, the best things in life are the ones we don't plan." Henry turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you really believe that?" "I have to," she said simply, "because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here." As the due date drew closer, Emily began to experience vivid dreams. Dreams of holding the baby, of seeing his first smile, of hearing his first laugh. They were beautiful, but they also filled her with a deep, aching sadness. She knew that once he was born, she would have to let him go, and no matter how much she tried to prepare herself, she wasn't sure she could. One night, unable to sleep, she went to the kitchen for a glass of water. To her surprise, she found Henry there, seated at the counter with a cup of tea in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. He shrugged. "I've had a lot on my mind." Emily poured herself a glass of water and joined him at the counter. For a while, they sat in silence. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Do you ever think about what kind of father you'll be?" she asked suddenly, the question surprising even herself. Henry looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Every day," he admitted. "And to be honest, I have no idea. My own father wasn't exactly a shining example. He was cold, distant, more concerned with his business than his family. I swore I'd never be like him, but now..." He trailed off, staring into his tea. "No, you're afraid you might be?" Emily finished for him. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I want to do this right, but I don't know if I'm capable of it." Emily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "The fact that you're worried about it means you care, and that's a good start." Henry looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't before: hope. The day of the birth arrived sooner than either of them expected. Emily woke in the early hours of the morning to a sharp pain in her abdomen. She knew immediately that it was time. Henry, alerted by the staff, was by her side within minutes, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. "I'm fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But we need to go, now." The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and adrenaline. Henry stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and reassuring her, even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. When they arrived, the medical team sprang into action, and Emily was wheeled into the delivery room. Henry, defying the doctor's suggestions to wait outside, insisted on staying. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, his hand clasping Emily's. "I'm staying right here." Hours later, the cries of a newborn filled the room. Emily, exhausted but overwhelmed with emotion, looked down at her son as the doctor placed him in her arms. He was tiny, perfect, and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Henry stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the baby. For a moment, all the walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Ellie, I'm incredible." Emily looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "We did this," she said softly. "We brought him into the world." Henry nodded, his gaze never leaving the baby. "And we'll do everything we can to give him the life he deserves." In that moment, Emily realized that their arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. They were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. They were a family. Unperfect, unconventional, but real. As the baby let out a small, contented sigh, Henry reached out, gently placing a hand on his son's tiny head, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly complete. Top of form. Over the next few weeks, life at the mansion took on a new rhythm. The birth of the baby had shifted the dynamic entirely, and both Emily and Henry found themselves navigating unfamiliar territory. It wasn't just the sleepless nights and the constant demands of caring for a newborn. It was the profound changes happening within each of them as individuals. Henry, in particular, was discovering parts of himself he didn't know existed. He had expected fatherhood to be a formal obligation, something he could approach with the same detached efficiency that had brought him success in business. But every time he held his son, every time the baby's tiny fingers curled around his own, he felt an inexplicable warmth, a tenderness that defied logic. One morning, as Henry was pacing the nursery with the baby in his arms, Emily stood silently in the doorway, watching him. He moved with a surprising ease, murmuring softly to the baby as he rocked him back and forth. It was a side of Henry she had never seen, a softness, a vulnerability that seemed to melt away the edges of his otherwise sharp demeanor. "You're getting the hang of this," Emily said, stepping into the room. Henry turned to her, a small smile playing at his lips. "It's easier than I thought, or maybe he just likes me." Emily chuckled, moving closer. "You're doing great. Better than I expected, honestly." Henry's smile faded slightly, and he looked down at the baby. I didn't think I had it in me, he admitted. But he makes me want to be better. For him. Emily felt her chest tighten. She had been so focused on her own struggles, the emotional toll of carrying the child, the uncertainty of her future, that she hadn't fully appreciated how deeply Henry was being transformed by the experience. You are better, she said softly, whether you realize it or not. As the weeks turned into months, Emily and Henry settled into an uneasy but functional partnership. They shared responsibilities for the baby, and though their interactions were often laced with tension, there were moments of unexpected connection, brief flashes of understanding that hinted at something deeper. One evening, as they sat in the living room after putting the baby to bed, Henry broke the silence with a question that caught Emily off guard. Have you thought about staying? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes betraying the weight of the question. Emily hesitated, unsure how to respond. You've asked me that before, she said carefully, and you never gave me a real answer. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. I don't know, Henry. This wasn't the life I imagined for myself. It's hard to reconcile what I wanted with where I am now. Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I know this isn't what you planned. It's not what I planned either, but that doesn't mean it can't work. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Emily nodded, though her mind was far from settled. The idea of staying had been lurking in the back of her mind for weeks, but the fear of getting hurt, of making a mistake she couldn't undo, held her back. One afternoon, Stephanie approached Emily with an envelope in hand. This came for you, she said, handing it over with a smile. Emily frowned, taking the envelope and opening it cautiously. Inside was a letter from an old friend, one of the few connections she had managed to maintain during her years of struggle. The letter was warm, filled with updates about mutual acquaintances and an invitation to visit. For the first time in months, Emily found herself thinking about the world beyond the mansion. She wondered what it would be like to step back into that world, to reclaim the parts of herself that felt so far away now. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she felt a pang of guilt. Leaving would mean leaving her child behind, and the idea of being apart from him was almost unbearable. When she mentioned the letter to Henry that evening, his reaction surprised her. You should go, he said simply. Emily looked at him, startled. You should go, he repeated. Visit your friend, take some time for yourself. And leave the baby? I can handle him for a few days, Henry said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I think I've proven I'm capable. Emily hesitated, torn between the desire for a break and the fear of being away. But the idea of reconnecting with her old life, even briefly, was too tempting to ignore. The trip was both liberating and bittersweet. Emily spent the days catching up with her friend, reminiscing about old times and sharing stories about her current life. But even in the midst of laughter and nostalgia, her thoughts kept drifting back to the mansion, to her son, and to Henry. She found herself wondering what they were doing, whether Henry was managing without her. The thought of him alone with the baby, reading to him, rocking him to sleep, it was a version of Henry she never could have imagined when they first met, and yet now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When she returned to the mansion, the first thing she saw was Henry sitting on the floor of the nursery, the baby in his lap, surrounded by a sea of toys. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a smile. Welcome back, he said, his voice warm. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. How did it go? We survived, Henry said with a chuckle, though I think he missed you. Emily crossed the room and scooped the baby into her arms, holding him close as tears filled her eyes. I missed him too, she whispered. And me? Henry asked, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. Emily looked at him, her heart racing. Maybe a little, she admitted, a small smile playing at her lips. As the baby grew, so did the bond between Emily and Henry. Their partnership became more seamless, their conversations more personal. They began to share their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, replaced by a mutual respect and, perhaps, something more. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Henry turned to Emily with a look she hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice tentative, "about what you said, about not imagining this life for yourself." Emily frowned, unsure where he was going. "What about it?" "I think maybe that's what makes it worth fighting for," he said. "The fact that neither of us planned for this, but here we are. Maybe that's the point." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. "Henry, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to stay," he said, his voice steady. "Not because of the baby, but because of us. I don't want this to end." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. She had spent so long guarding herself, preparing for the day she would have to walk away. But now, faced with the possibility of something real, something lasting, she wasn't sure she could say no. "I'll think about it," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Henry reached out, taking her hand in his. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Emily and Henry began to rebuild their lives together, not as two strangers bound by a contract, but as partners, as a family. They faced challenges and setbacks, but through it all, they found strength in each other. And as Emily watched her son take his first steps, his tiny hands reaching for Henry's steady ones, she realized that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. As the seasons turned, the mansion began to feel less like a symbol of formality and more like a home. The once imposing walls seemed to soften, imbued with the laughter of a growing child and the quiet, shared moments between Emily and Henry. Yet, there was an unspoken tension that lingered in the air, a question neither of them dared to voice aloud. What comes next? One afternoon, Henry surprised Emily by suggesting they take the baby out of the mansion for the first time. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind that painted the trees in vibrant shades of orange and red. Emily was hesitant at first. She worried about the baby being exposed to the world beyond their secluded life. But Henry's gentle insistence won her over, and soon they found themselves in a quiet park on the edge of the city. Daisi actus, collecto demo editiolas plibetarias essentialas. The baby, bundled in a cozy knit blanket, sat in a stroller, his wide eyes taking in the world around him for the first time. Emily walked beside him, her hand lightly grazing the stroller's handle, while Henry pushed with his usual quiet confidence. "It feels strange," Emily said after a while, her voice breaking the silence. Henry glanced at her. "Strange how?" "Being out here," she replied, gesturing to the park around them. "It's like we're just normal people." Henry smiled faintly. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." They walked in silence for a few moments, the crisp air filling their lungs. Emily found herself stealing glances at Henry, marveling at how much he had changed since the day they met. He still carried himself with the same composure, the same air of authority. But there was a softness to him now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. As they approached a small pond, Henry stopped and turned to Emily. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, curious. "What would you do if none of this had happened?" he asked, his gaze steady. "If we hadn't met, if there was no contract, what would your life look like?" Emily hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She looked down at the baby who was babbling happily in his stroller, and then back at Henry. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think about it sometimes, but I can't imagine it anymore. My life before this, it feels like it belonged to someone else." Henry's expression softened. "I feel the same way. Before you, before him, everything was just hollow. I didn't realize how much I was missing." Emily felt her heart ache at his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this life they were building could last. But part of her was still afraid of getting hurt, of losing the fragile happiness they had found. As if sensing her hesitation, Henry reached out and took her hand. "I know it's not easy," he said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I want this, us, to work, for him and for us." Emily looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity. Slowly, she nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I want that too. That evening, as they sat in the living room, the baby asleep in Emily's arms, Henry surprised her again. There's something I've been working on, he said, his tone hesitant. Emily frowned, curious. What is it? He stood and crossed the room, retrieving a folder from a nearby desk. Returning to the couch, he handed it to her. Open it. Emily set the baby down in his bassinet and opened the folder. Inside was a series of sketches, architectural plans for what appeared to be a cozy, modern home. Her brow furrowed in confusion. What is this? She asked, looking up at Henry. It's for us, he said simply. I've been working with an architect to design a house, a real home, away from the mansion where we can start fresh, somewhere we can raise him together. Emily stared at the plans, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. The house was beautiful, warm, inviting, and so different from the cold opulence of the mansion. It was everything she had dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. Henry, she began, her voice trembling. It's perfect. He reached out, taking her hand. I know this hasn't been easy, Emily, for either of us, but I want to build something real with you, a life, a family, and I want us to do it together. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Let's do it. As the weeks turned into months, the plans for their new home began to take shape. Emily and Henry worked together, choosing every detail, from the color of the walls to the layout of the garden. It was a labor of love, a tangible symbol of the life they were creating. The day they moved in, the sun was shining, casting a warm glow over the new beginnings that awaited them. As Emily stood in the doorway, holding her son, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Henry stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and for the first time, they felt like a true family. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was theirs. And as they stepped into their new home, Emily knew that they had found something worth holding on to. A love that had been born out of the most unexpected circumstances, and a future that was theirs to shape. Want more stories like this? Click the video on screen for another unforgettable one, and don't forget to subscribe for more exciting uploads coming your way.